Hi guys. Today, Vivian and we're gonna covering the reading about psychosocial effects of SNS use. So before we move on to the details of our seed video today, let's have an overview of our presentation. So at first, we're gonna have a little introduction of the study, and then we're going to talk about the nuance of psychosocial aspects that we sometimes get confused about. And thirdly, we're gonna talk more about social capital. We're gonna talk about what is social capital and how social capital is influencing SNS use and psychological effects of those users. And after that, we're gonna talk about the possible solutions we thought about for those people who are in a lower social capital group to jump out of their vicious circle. And at the end, we're gonna share a little more about our own thoughts on the COVID's influence of social capital use and SNS use. So first, let's move on to the negative effects of psychological well-being, which are the reasons why the experts are studying the phenomena of SNS use and social capital. There are typically two types of negative psychological effects. The first one is called depression. The second is called the fear of missing out. Facebook depression is depression at a time where you saw your friend's post, but you don't feel that your life is as good as theirs. So you start to compare your life with their lives and you feel inferior. This inferiority causes depression and makes you use more SNS and kind of like keep the circle going. But however, you're not getting any positive emotions out of your SNS use. So when people usually use Facebook for this purpose of checking on your friends, that's why they name this kind of depression, Facebook depression. And there's a second negative effects on psychological well-being. It's called fear of missing out. It happens when you see your friends are posting a picture hanging out with the mutual friends that you have, but you're not included in the group or you're not included in those events. So you fear that you're missing out on something they talk about. And this is also happens a lot on social media when people are posting their experience with on the social media platform. So the people who are not included in that picture will see what they have done and feel that they want to be included. And they are also afraid of missing out this event the next time. So this worry and anxiety compose the fear of missing out. And there are a lot of previous studies that have done their research on SNS use, social capital, and psychological effects caused by those two. However, those studies are all cross-sectional studies where they only examine one or the relationships between two elements that we are going to talk about. It's either social SNS use and social capital, or social capital and psychological effects. There's no such study that have integrated these three factors together to see whether SNS use has effects on psychological well-being of the users by considering the moderating factor of social capital. And next, Vivian is going to talk more about what is social capital and how it is influencing people.
Social capital is obtained through social interaction. Its resources are both tangible and intangible that include trust, norms, and networks. Social capital is classified into two categories, bridging and bonding. Bridging social capital refers to resources from loose connections between individuals, while bonding social capital refers to resources from close relationships, inclusive of emotional support. And SNS is a platform for network communication, operates as a communication medium by forming networks founded on sharing information. Social capital has been highlighted in SNS studies because it deals with resources from the user's social networks. Social capital has been reported to play a central role in the effect of SNS on the user's lives. Social capital provides SNS users with an alternative way of connecting with others who share their interests or relational goals. and plays the role of a new venue for building social trust and for promoting civic and political participation.
So when we are talking about psychological effects that the study is investigating, there are three types of those effects: depression, loneliness, and life satisfaction. However, there are a lot of times we get confused with depression and loneliness. We simply categorize these two different emotions as negative emotions without knowing the detailed difference between those two. So next, we're gonna talk more about what is depression, what is loneliness, and what is life satisfaction. Depression is a state where one is constantly sad and loses interest in the activities that he or she once found pleasurable. And this happens when depression happens, it strongly affects interpersonal relationship. For people who are depressed, they are eager to find someone to establish better and healthy interpersonal relationships. However, the state of being depressed hinders them from doing so. Even if they're trying so hard to gain interpersonal relationship, they may not succeed in the end because they're in a state of depressed. So this is kind of the dilemma that people who are depressed are in right now. They want to go out of their circle, but because they have depression at the first hand, they may not ever achieve that. And there are conflicting study results on the relationship between depression and SNS use. There are studies showing that depression has a positive relationship with SNS use. When people are using SNS excessively, the degree of depression may increase accordingly. However, there are also study results showing that depression has nothing to do with SNS use. So to help clear up this confusion, that's what the that's the purpose of this study that they have done. They include social capital as the moderating factor, trying to solve this conflicting study results as presented by other researchers. Second, loneliness. Loneliness is a negative emotional state wherein personal need for belonging is not satisfied, and one's social ties are lower than expected. And one thing interesting about the definition of loneliness is that there's one criteria about loneliness is when some people are having a lower expected social ties, which means loneliness is a very subjective value. When someone are feeling lonely, maybe a better way for them is not just trying to rush into building new relationships with others, but lower their expectation of the relationship, which may be a better solution for those people. And also, loneliness is an important measuring factor of the quality of interpersonal relationships. When we are having so much friends on Facebook, when having friends is becomes so easy by just click on the button on the Facebook app, it becomes very superficial. And this kind of relationship, this kind of network size does not solve the key problem of being lonely. What really solves loneliness is the quality of the interpersonal is the quality of those interpersonal relationships. Having a high quality interpersonal relationship may be better than having hundreds and thousands more friends that you don't really talk to and you don't really have the relationship to ask for a favor. Just like the depression we talked about, there are also various studies showing different effects of SNS use and loneliness. The third factor is life satisfaction. Life satisfaction is a general evaluation of one's quality of life according to personally chosen criteria. Just like loneliness, life satisfaction is also a self-defined criteria. But there are also conflicting study results on SNS use and life satisfaction. However, there's one consensus that academia has achieved is that social connection is one of the most significant factors influencing life satisfaction. And the above three factors are what we are what the study want to investigate as the psychosocial effects. So next, Vivian's gonna talk more about SNS and those psychosocial effects.
Related to social capital, psychosocial well-being has been a key issue as a social effect of SNS use. Researchers have found associations between SNS users' psychosocial well-beings and social capital, including studies on the role of social capital with respect to SNS use and self-disclosure. The impact of SNS use on social capital formation in terms of the user's life satisfaction and the positive role played by SNS in increasing social capital and the user's social participation. SNS users gain benefits in terms of social capital from their participation in online activities. There was a clear difference in the effects of SNS use on psychosocial factors. Considering the moderating role of social capital, higher versus lower, in the lower social capital group, increased SNS use time showed a negative effect, and that is the increased SNS use time increased the degree of depression. In the higher social capital group, the increased SNS use time reduced the degree of loneliness. However, some people experience strong Facebook depression, which is hopelessness and psychological depression that may occur to Facebook users who compare their lives with their friends' lives based on the positive images posted on the Facebook. There were mutual relationships among SNS use networks, or network size, and psychosocial factors through social capital, either higher or lower group. The increased SNS use time affected the psychosocial factors such as depression in the higher social capital group and the loneliness in the lower social capital group. And psychosocial factor also affected SNS use and network size. Depression, like SNS use impacted the network size in both groups. In turn, the psychosocial factors may affect the SNS use and the network size. Like the depression, well, the depression increased well in both groups, and the life satisfaction strengthened in the network size. From the perspective of the reciprocal relations, the results imply an interesting and unique finding, which is the socialization effect among SNS use, psychosocial factors, and the social capital. For the lower social capital group, a vicious cycle was observed. The increased SNS use exacerbated the depression, and in turn, the increased degree of depression augmented the SNS use. The study participants in the group used SNS to reduce their depression, but conversely, their increased SNS use reinforced their depression. Contrary to that, for the higher social capital group, a virtuous circle was found. SNS use reduced the participants' loneliness and increased the network size. The increased network size strengthened the degree of life satisfaction. And this result implied that social capital is a key factor in explaining and predicting the effects of SNS use. And for the possible solutions that help lower social capital people to jump out of their vicious cycle, the first step we think is that people should be aware of their social capital status, either through self-assessment by quiz or asking the psychotherapist for advice. Second, depressed people are unlikely to establish good relationships online, and increased SNS use time and highly depressed people were found to have had a poor interpersonal relationships. So therefore, if people realize that they feel depressed using SNS, they should learn some strategies of how to establish a healthy interpersonal relationship with others from professional people. Then remember to control the time you spend on SNS. If you feel uncomfortable, hopeless, or depressed, stop using it and do something that can make you feel happy. Additionally, don't compare your life with others. The negative effect of SNS use can be explained from the viewpoint of Facebook depression or fear of missing out. So when one sees a picture on SNS depicting a friend's happy life or diverse activities, one may feel depressed. Believe that no one will post some suffers and difficulties they met in lives on SNS. So do not compare your life with others. Finally, categorize what kinds of content you will make you feel pleasure and what kind of content will make you feel depressed. And try not to look those content that make you sad. So under the COVID, I spent like around 4 months in United States and cannot going out. So at first, because the school didn't end, we still have assignments, midterms, and finals, and so I didn't spend a lot of time using SNS. However, after I graduate, every day of my life is basically full of using SNS, either chat with my friends or watching the YouTube videos. So SNS take majority of time in my life, and I don't think this increase the social capital since I only chat with my close friends and because I cannot go out, so I can't increase my network size. And when my majority of my friends go back to China and go out freely, I feel a little bit depressed when I saw their posts of traveling around on social media. But that depression doesn't last for a long time when I stop looking at them. Yeah.
So for me, during this special COVID time, I have like kind of like three thoughts about SNS use and social capital. The first one is that don't be afraid to reach out. When I was self-quarantined in the US, I feel very lonely because there's a life-threatening risk outside the apartment, and I can't talk to my friends as usual because a lot of them has go home already. So what I did is that I reach out to the friends that are still living just besides me. So I talked to them. So I went out dinner, not went out, but went to their house and cooked dinner with them and play some games to kind of like alleviate myself from loneliness and depression of this pandemic. So what I want to say is that when you are in a very depressed mode, uh, don't be afraid to reach out, and those people that you may be afraid of approaching may also welcomes you. So you never know what's going to happen, and SNS is a very powerful tool for you to reach out to your friends. And the second thought is that after this pandemic, there will be so much more people using SNS because this is the only and necessary way for you to communicate when you're quarantined. Even if there are some people who kind of like reject the idea of using SNS, or who maybe just kind of too old to catch up with the age, they are forcing themselves to learn to use SNS use just to maintain the basic human needs to socialize with other people. So after this pandemic, the size of SNS platform will grow even larger, and the SNS and the topic of SNS use and its impact on user psychology will become a more heated discussion direction for the academia. And also, the third thing I'm having with social capital and SNS use in this COVID time is that I feel like people may be even more aware of the importance of having a good social capital, because when we first start facing this pandemic, all the face masks are run out. You cannot buy the face masks anywhere, or any cleaning supplies. They're all bought out. So when you really need those supplies that you have no way to get them, the only resort for you is to seek friends from your friends to ask them whether they have a spare of resources that you can use. However, if you don't have a good social capital, or you did not try any effort to maintain a good level of social capital, it may be really, really hard for you to open your mouth and talk to them, saying, could you give me some face masks during this time where everybody is needing one? So I think the COVID time has really changed people's view on views on SNS, and people's use and frequency on SNS use. And also, a lot of people are maybe more inclined to use SNS to substitute some physical contacts that they had before, such as having a meeting, such as going to work. And all this will be more sorted out when the whole pandemic has passed. But right now, we're just hoping everything will be better and we can go back to campus and trying to not use SNS that much during class. So that's all of our presentation. Thank you for your listening. And if you have any thoughts, please write down on the reply below this seed video. And hope everyone have a good week.